When Vladimir Putin launched his Ukraine invasion, he thought he had all the time in the world to complete it. Not that Russia would need it, of course. Ukraine would fall in a week, Putin thought, but it didn't. Russia would be fine though. With such a massive military and more equipment than Ukraine could ever hope to muster, the smash-and-grab special operation would turn into a war of attrition that Russia could win. It hasn't won, and after nearly 4 years, the quagmire that Putin created has left Russia in a terrible situation. Putin is running out of time if he wants to win in Ukraine, as the Russian strategy collapses around him. That's according to Nigel Gould-Davis, who recently sat down for a discussion with Dominic Prazel, where the two discussed a recent article written by Davis. That article suggests that time is no longer on Putin's side due to 3 key issues, all of which have combined to force Putin into accelerating the Russian strategy to the point where his country is now in danger. Davis, who is a senior research fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies and once served as UK's ambassador to Belarus, starts off by saying that the Russian time crunch isn't necessarily solely down to Putin's strategy or Ukraine's defense. Other players have dictated how the Ukraine war goes, and those other players are helping to put Russia in the position in which it finds itself. Davis encourages people to think back all the way to March 2022. At that point, it had become pretty clear that Putin had failed in his initial effort to capture Ukraine. The invasion, launched at the end of February, was meant to be done and dusted by March. As Business Insider reported in March 2022, Putin, or at least his advisors and propagandists, believed that Russia would take Ukraine in as little as 2 days. When that didn't happen, the floodgates were opened for external players to enter the conflict. It's been clear from that point on that the war will be decided as much as anything, not only by the fortunes and inherent capacities of the two combatants, Ukraine and Russia, but by the willingness and ability of other states, belligerents contributing to the war effort, Davis tells Prazel. Of course, the collective West was the first to step up. Since January 24, 2022, the US and Europe have combined to provide or pledge €392.15 billion to Ukraine, which amounts to around $450 billion. That's per the Kiel Institute Ukraine funding tracker, and it's notable that these numbers don't include countries like the UK, Canada, Japan, and others outside of the major donors that have also collectively sent billions of dollars to Ukraine. Support hasn't been in short supply for Ukraine, and that support has played a huge role in ensuring the conflict has stretched on for as long as it has. Initially, Russia's failure to take Ukraine in a flash led to the question of how long and to what extent the West would support Ukraine, Davis points out. We have that answer, as support is ongoing. With the war lasting so long, Russia was then forced to call on external supporters of its own. China, North Korea, and Iran have all helped Russia in one way or another. The latter two have provided weapons, ranging from artillery shells to drones. China helps in subtler ways, such as selling dual-use components and buying massive quantities of Russian oil. What these nations provide to Russia is almost less important than the fact that Russia is relying on external parties to keep its war effort going, and that is what has really damaged Russia when it comes to its long-term strategy. If we therefore frame the dynamics of the war in terms of the willingness and ability of other countries to contribute to the war effort, Davis tells Prazel, I think that puts into clarifying perspective some important developments which have taken place in the last few months, almost all of which are harmful to Russia's long-term prospects. There are 3 of these developments to combine to put Russia on a timeline in Ukraine. The first might well be the most devastating. Putin has failed to make effective use of Donald Trump's becoming president of the United States. This was a great opportunity, Davis says, and Putin had spent much of 2023 waiting for the return of Trump. It's obvious why, after we've seen the roller coaster of events that have unfolded in 2025 since Trump returned to the White House. Davis suggests that Trump saw the Ukraine war more from Russia's point of view than Ukraine's when he first entered office, leading to great fear in the West that the US would abandon Ukraine altogether. And for a while, it seemed that Putin's manipulations were going to win the day. The first quarter of 2025 saw Trump hold a volatile White House meeting with Zelensky that would have gone down a treat in Russia. In early March, the US suspended military intelligence sharing with Ukraine, which followed a suspension of military aid. Both would be resumed shortly thereafter. But when Trump started blaming Zelensky and Ukraine for starting the war with Russia in April, it seemed for all the world that Putin had Trump on his side. It would only be a matter of time before the US pulled away from Ukraine altogether. And without one of its largest supporters, Ukraine's downfall might well have happened. However, Putin seemed so confident that he had Trump on his side that he started to overplay his hand as we entered the second half of 2025. For now, we're in a moment where Trump's theory of peace has changed from one that required pressure to be put on Ukraine to compromise to a theory of peace through constraining and pressuring Russia, Davis tells Prazel. That's the last thing that Putin wanted, and other outlets have gone so far as to claim that Trump has turned his back on Putin. CNN was among them back in July, noting that Trump had started to berate Putin publicly, likely out of frustration over the fact that Putin was doing little more than giving lip service to the idea of announcing a ceasefire or signing a peace treaty with Ukraine. Putin had messed Trump around too much, and the US president was becoming openly hostile toward Russia. Though things between Putin and Trump had the potential to be mended when the Russian president visited Alaska for a summit, the relationship between the pair has deteriorated again since then. Putin gave yet more false promises of wanting peace. Again, he went back on them. By October, the BBC was reporting on how Trump had decided that pressure on Putin was the only way to bring the war to an end. The many carrots dangled in front of the Russian leader's face had failed to yield bites, so Trump was instead turning to the stick by threatening sanctions against Russia and even suggesting that the US would start providing Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. Putin has failed, Davis declares. It's a diplomacy that's not merely inflexible but remarkably inept. He has failed to use the clear and obvious opportunity, hasn't even really tried to give Trump an excuse to continue engaging constructively with Russia, Davis adds. All of this leads to Trump being frustrated with Putin, and that frustration solidifies something that Putin believed he could get taken away: America's support for Ukraine. Part 1 of Putin's strategy for keeping the war in Ukraine going for as long as he needed has failed. The US isn't withdrawing, and the pressure Trump might have once placed on Zelensky now falls squarely on Putin's shoulders. Russia has completely mismanaged the biggest external player in the Ukraine war. That brings us to the second issue Davis notes, which is placing even more of a time crunch on Putin to achieve the victory in Ukraine that has eluded him since February 2022. This is an issue that is only just barely less important than Putin's mismanagement of the Trump situation, and it will have rattled Russia like a shotgun blast right to the gut. NATO members have committed to a massive increase in their defense spend. An increase to 5% of their gross domestic products, or GDP to be more precise. Bear in mind that NATO's recommendation for defense spending before Russia invaded Ukraine was 2%, and most of the organization's members didn't even spend that much. As the Atlantic Council says, just 6 NATO members hit or exceeded the 2% target in 2021, compared to 23 that were hitting it by mid-2024. Now those NATO members are going to shoot for 5% of GDP spending on defense. Trump is happy about that outcome. He'd been complaining about how the rest of NATO wasn't paying its way and relied too much on the US during his first term as president. Putin would have seen those complaints as a potential lever he could use to distance Trump, and thus the US, from its NATO allies. Instead, NATO ended up essentially agreeing with Trump while recognizing the growing threat that Russia presents. The group's members are going to be spending more than ever, and that is terrible news for Putin. After all, it's not just that NATO's European members are going to be spending more on their defense. It's that they have more to spend than Russia could ever hope to generate. Collectively, NATO's European members have much more money to spend than Putin can muster, even in Russia's best years. Europe has a collective GDP that is 10 times that of Russia. And if Europe committed just 0.2% of that GDP to Ukraine, it would be enough to bridge the financial gaps between Russia and Ukraine, according to the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. Davis outlines what this means for Putin. Even a small increase in GDP devoted to defense would result in a vast superiority in material defense capabilities, Davis says of NATO's European members. Even if European member states in NATO got to 3% or 3.5%, that's something that Russia could not possibly match. What we see here isn't necessarily an issue that has a huge impact on Russia inside Ukraine. Putin's failed strategy in Ukraine has resulted in something far bigger than he anticipated. Europe has woken up to the Russian threat. And it's realized that having so much more money than Russia places it in a powerful position. A slow onrushing tsunami of defense capability for Europe's own defense is heading Russia's way, Davis says. And the only thing that Russia has to hold over Europe's NATO members is Russia's nuclear superiority. The nuclear gap could still present a problem, and that gap is massive. France and the UK are the only European members of NATO that have nuclear warheads. The Arms Control Association says that they have 515 between them. Russia has more than 10 times that amount, and it could try to use this nuclear gap to create pressure. But that's where the US comes back into play. It almost matches Russia in nuclear capability with 5,225 nukes to Russia's 5,580. Any attempt by Russia to use nuclear leverage on European NATO members will be met by a stern US reminder that it has nukes as well. The point is that Putin's strategy has ended up making Europe much stronger. Combine that with the Russian leader's failure to sway Trump, and you get 2 key issues that are putting pressure on Putin to find an end to the Ukraine war in any way that he can, other than the peace that everybody is pushing him to declare. With that, we come to the third thing that Davis notes is piling even more pressure onto Putin: growing strains inside Russia. As much as the Kremlin might want to portray the Russian people as being fully behind their president, even as hundreds of thousands of their soldiers die in Ukraine, the reality is that the average Russian is struggling. The battering that Russia's economy is taking as a result of the Ukraine invasion is starting to be felt all across the country, and that's as bad for Putin as the issues Russia now has with the US and Europe. Look within Russia at the growing strains that this combination of major war and severe sanctions are imposing on the Russian economy, Davis notes. I would say that we are entering a period now where the future will clearly be worse than the present or the past, as current Russia's economy goes, and there are growing strains and tensions and distortions, and these are producing quiet signs of anxiety among parts of Russia's elites. That's a group that Putin doesn't want to anger. Russia's elites could be the key to turning the rest of the population against him, especially if they band together because they're losing money due to Putin's war. Russia's economic situation certainly looks bleak. As DW reported in September, Russia is dealing with stalled growth, massive declines in its energy revenue, and a budget deficit. None of these issues is being made any better by Western sanctions and Ukraine's strategy of repeatedly striking Russian oil refineries. Russia has already raised its value-added tax to 22% from its previous 20%, showcasing Putin's willingness to pass off the cost of the war he started to his own people. Russia has a budget deficit of around $50 billion, DW says, and the consequences are already clear to see. Public services from education to healthcare are receiving budget cuts to keep the war going. None of this means that Russia's people are on the verge of outright rebellion. Both Davis and Praisel point this out, with the latter playing devil's advocate to Davis's argument. Russia also has a low debt-to-GDP ratio, which works in Putin's favor. However, the fact remains that Russia's financial situation was much better before the launch of the Ukraine invasion than it is right now, and the longer the war goes on, the more money Putin spends, all to the Russian population's detriment. Think of this third issue as a slow-burning deadline. If Russia runs out of money or Putin deprives the country's elite or its people of so much that they end up rebelling, then it's game over for Russia. Putin's attritional strategy will have worked. It would have just taken him out instead of Ukraine. Russia's president is very aware of the many missteps and failures that have led to this trio of issues, and his response to everything that now afflicts Russia is very telling. As Davis notes, Russia has been getting more aggressive in recent months because it knows it's working to a deadline that was never meant to be a factor. We see this in Russia's recent drone incursions into European airspace. Since September, Russia has engaged in a constant campaign of sending drones and other aerial assets into the territory of NATO's European members. Most recently, Russian drone fragments have been found deep in Romania, The Independent reported on November 11th. Poland was the most prominent victim of Russia's evolution of its hybrid warfare strategy, as it dealt with an incursion of about 20 Russian drones in early September. Both Poland and Romania are building new defenses to deal with these incursions, the outlet adds. These drone tactics are an attempt by Putin to project power. He wants to intimidate NATO's European members by showing them that Russia's drones can reach them no matter how far away they may be. Instead, this escalation is starting to look like desperation from the Russian camp. Beyond this escalation, Russia has also been hitting Ukraine's energy infrastructure hard as the country moves into its difficult winter months. These attacks aren't new, as Davis points out, but they're powerful enough to really start putting the squeeze on Ukraine. On October 21st, the Kyiv Independent reported that these energy sector strikes had intensified as the prospect of Ukraine receiving Tomahawk missiles from the US dwindled. Putin may have thought that Ukraine would have no way of responding, and he's been sending drones and missiles in waves to hit Ukrainian energy. On November 9th, The Guardian noted that these energy infrastructure attacks have been effective enough to reduce Ukraine's generating capacity to zero. Now many of the country's citizens are facing blackouts that can last as long as 16 hours. While Putin is getting what he wants from these strikes, it's also clear why he's ramped them up so much. It's all about the time pressure his own strategy has placed him under. Putin is desperate to show the West that Ukraine is crumbling. With that showcase of Russian power comes leverage that Putin hopes he can use to negotiate the type of uncompromising peace that he wants. However, as we've already established, Trump has turned his back on Putin, and Europe is strengthening itself and Ukraine through higher spending. Putin's Hail Mary throw at Ukraine's energy infrastructure truly is a last-gasp attempt to assert Russia's dominance. If that throw fails, Russia may lose the war, at least in the sense of it being immune to Western pressure. It's no coincidence that the nuclear threats are starting to emerge from Russia once again. On November 5th, the Kyiv Independent reported on comments made by the country's defense minister Andrei Belousov. Responding to news that the US is working on the modernization of its nuclear arsenal, Belousov said, "The US is engaged in the accelerated modernization of its strategic offensive weapons. I believe it's advisable to begin preparations immediately." Russia tends to start talking about nuclear weapons when it knows that it's on the back foot. The acceleration of the country's strategy, both in terms of the hybrid war being waged on Europe and the more intense strikes on Ukrainian energy infrastructure, isn't a sign of Putin's strength. Accelerating is indicative of Putin's desperation. Russia's leader became so out of touch because of his single-minded focus on Ukraine that he led his country into a corner. Russia has to win in Ukraine, and it has to do it quickly. Putin is running out of time, and there may be little he can do about it. There is this sense of a window of opportunity for Russia slowly beginning to close if things don't change, Davis notes. So Russia therefore needs to accelerate the ways it's implementing its theories of victory, which is to grind down Ukraine materially and militarily, and to outlast and divide and intimidate the West politically. If the window slams shut, Putin is done for. And who knows, he might end up finding himself the victim of an unfortunate fall from that window if he's not able to accomplish his goals in time. With its hypersonic missiles, Russia has developed a new threat, not just to Ukraine, but to the rest of the world. These missiles are fast and they hit hard, capable of hitting speeds above Mach 5. Russia's hypersonic missiles are supposed to be practically impossible to stop, even by the world's most advanced air defense systems. Then, along comes Ukraine. It has come up with a method to send Russia's Kinzhal hypersonic missiles completely off course, and it does it without firing a single shot. The country has outsmarted Russia's most advanced missile with a genius new piece of equipment. You won't believe how this new defensive system works. Ukraine has found a way to make music the master of Russia's Kinzhal missiles. It wasn't supposed to be like this for Vladimir Putin. When Russia unveiled the Kinzhal threat, it believed it had a nigh invulnerable missile that would force the rest of the world to stand up and take notice. As Interesting Engineering reports, Russia's hypersonic missile can reach speeds of Mach 5.7 while carrying a devastatingly powerful 1,000-pound warhead. It has a solid range too. A Kinzhal can travel about 300 miles, which is far enough to allow Russia to launch the missile from modified MiG-31s almost anywhere in Ukraine. It can certainly hit Kyiv when firing this missile from border regions or occupied territory. Kinzhal is lethal, and Ukraine has felt its full force on several occasions. The most recent of these strikes was reported by RBC Ukraine on November 8th. It says that Russia launched an enormous attack that combined Kinzhal, caliber, and ballistic missiles with an overwhelming horde of more than 450 attack drones. Ukraine's president highlighted the results of the strike, stating, "So far 11 people have been injured, including children. Unfortunately, one person has died. My condolences to their families. Dozens have been rescued." Rescue efforts were ongoing at the time of the report, for which Russia used 7 of its Kinzhal missiles. This is just the most recent Kinzhal attack. There have been many more. Sheer speed is the Kinzhal's biggest advantage. Even Ukraine's Patriot air defense systems, which are among the most advanced in the world and have proven themselves extremely effective at stopping every other type of Russian missile, are almost helpless in the face of Russia's hypersonic behemoth. Several outlets have reported on this, with Forces News even going so far as to suggest that Russia's new super-fast missiles are Patriot-proof. It points out that Russia is firing fewer missiles at Ukraine than it has in the past, but more of those missiles are getting through. We see that in Ukraine's missile interception rate between August and September, which dropped to just 6% compared to 37% at which it stood prior. Russia has been upgrading its Kinzhal missiles, it seems, as they now combine ridiculous speed with the ability to deviate from their previously predictable paths. As the missiles zigzag their way toward Ukraine, Patriots are having a hard time dealing with them. Hypersonic missiles are such a problem for Ukraine that the spokesperson for the country's Air Force Command, Yuri Inat, was forced to comment on the issue on November 5th. Speaking about Russia's Iskander-M missiles, which have similar speeds and capabilities to the Kinzhal, Inat said that Russia has started to use its hypersonic missiles more frequently, and this in turn also makes it more difficult to shoot them down. The ratio of ballistic missiles to cruise missiles has increased compared to previous years. Plus, during an attack, a single Patriot battery looks in a certain direction it cannot see and hit Russian targets in a 360-degree radius, Inat claimed. There is a clear weakness in Ukraine's air defenses when it comes to the hypersonic threat. As 2025 draws to a close, Russia is exploiting that weakness more than ever before. Putin is hoping that the growing success of missiles like the Kinzhal and Iskander-M will send a message to the rest of the world. After all, most other countries are behind Russia when it comes to hypersonic development. As the BBC reports, the US is currently playing catch-up to both Russia and China when it comes to hypersonic missiles. Other major military powers, such as the UK, don't have anything that comes close to the likes of the Kinzhal, at least when it comes to pace. The BBC also made an interesting point in its article, stating, "For a missile to be classed as truly hypersonic in military terms, it needs to be maneuverable in flight. In other words, the army that fired it needs to be able to change course in sudden and unpredictable ways, even as it's hurtling towards its target at extreme speeds." That appears to be what Russia has achieved with its upgrades to its hypersonic missiles, which only makes them all the more deadly. The Patriot can't beat the Kinzhal, at least it can't do it consistently. For Putin, that should mean that he can parade around with his chest puffed out, knowing that Ukraine has practically no defense against the terrifying missiles that Russia is raining down on its cities. However, as so often has been the case during the war that he started, Putin has underestimated his foe. Where the most powerful military nations have failed to come up with a means to counter Russia's hypersonic missiles, Ukraine has developed something that is effective, efficient, and very capable of sending Russia's Kinzhals completely off course. That countermeasure even has a name: Lima. We'll dig much deeper into this system and what it means to Ukraine a little later in the video. For now, all you really need to know is that Lima is an electronic warfare or EW system that is currently being operated by Ukraine's Night Watch unit. This EW device has the ability to mess with the navigational signals being transmitted to Russia's hypersonic Kinzhal missiles, with the resulting confusion sending these missiles, along with their 1,000-pound warheads, completely off course. And you won't believe what Ukraine is using to mess with those navigational signals. The country has gone back in time and found that music is the answer to the Kinzhal problem. Specifically, Ukraine is using World War II-era music to take out Russia's Kinzhal missiles in what amounts to a mockery of Russia's reverence for its own role in that particular conflict. Russia is so proud of its World War II exploits that it holds an annual Victory Day parade that amounts to a showcase of the country's military hardware as Russia's leadership collectively pats itself on the back. World War II means a lot to Russia, and rightfully so. Ukraine is now forcing music from that conflict into Russia's Kinzhal missiles. Interesting Engineering has the details. It says that Ukraine's Night Watch unit has started to jam and divert Kinzhal missiles using a specific song named Our Father is Bandera. The song is a tribute to a Ukrainian nationalist leader named Stepan Bandera, who operated during World War II and has become something of a folk hero for Ukrainians who wish to maintain their independence. Bandera was a problematic figure. Though he was responsible for the creation of the Ukrainian National Army and Ukrainian National Committee in March 1945, he achieved those feats through negotiation with Nazi Germany. Bandera was a far-right nationalist himself, with some condemning him as a fascist. Others in Ukraine see him as a freedom fighter and even a martyr, meaning they're willing to overlook with whom he aligned himself during World War II so they can instead support the cause that he espoused, a Ukraine that was free of Soviet repression. It's likely this latter interpretation of Bandera that's influencing the music that Ukraine's Lima operators are pumping into the navigational systems of Russia's Kinzhal missiles. The Night Watch unit is trying to send a message to Putin that no matter how many missiles Russia fires, Ukraine will continue to fight for its sovereignty and independence. Only this time, it's allied with countries that are supporters of democracy and freedom. Controversial song choices aside, the use of music to knock out Kinzhal missiles is working. According to Interesting Engineering, the Night Watch unit has already managed to jam or divert around 12 Kinzhals since the end of October, and it's doing so by replacing the missile's satellite navigation signals with a song that will infuriate Putin and his ilk. The Lima works by drowning out the signals a missile relies upon for navigation with irrelevant noise and data. Savvy military enthusiasts will already be able to identify this as a technique called spoofing, which is one of the most effective EW tools available in an era when missiles, drones, and practically any weapon requiring some level of precision rely on GPS or Russian GLONASS signals to hit their target. Spoofing works by using radio interference to overpower weak global navigation satellite systems or GNSS signals. There are any number of reasons why a GNSS signal could be weak. By their very nature, these signals are already pretty weak, IFATCA points out. That's especially the case when they arrive at the receiver, which is the device Russia has in its hypersonic missiles to pick up the navigational signals that it's sending out. Other issues that can weaken GNSS signals can include obstructions, be they on the ground or in the Earth's atmosphere, along with poorly operated test equipment and incorrectly implemented GNSS receivers that are supposed to boost signals. We don't know what weaknesses Russia's Kinzhal missiles are dealing with, but Lima seems like it's able to exploit them. The spoofing that this new EW system can pull off causes the loss of initial signals. Those signals are then replaced with false signals such as Ukraine's World War II song, which then makes the Kinzhal missile's GNSS receiver believe that it's in a location that it isn't actually at. Serpentrio points out that even a cheap, software-defined radio can be enough to make a smartphone believe that it's on Mount Everest, which shows how susceptible GNSS signals can be to interference. Ukraine's Lima is much more powerful than these radios, and the effects are clear to see in the dozen or so Kinzhal missiles that have failed to hit their targets because of it. It's pretty simple to figure out what's happening to Russia's Kinzhal missiles from here. Overwhelmed by song, those missiles end up having absolutely no idea where they are. This could lead to all sorts of results, ranging from the missiles flying off course and away from its target, to the missile even believing that it has landed at its target. The important thing is that the Kinzhal gets neutralized. Its speed and ability to change directions, which are both features that make this hypersonic missile difficult for Patriots to handle, become non-factors. It doesn't matter how fast a missile can go when it's heading in the wrong direction. Interesting Engineering sums up the Lima's impact by highlighting one confirmed incident of the EW system working as intended. When Lima disrupts that connection, the missile's guidance system reverts to an inertial navigation system that quickly accumulates errors, the outlet reports. As a result, missiles may miss their targets by hundreds of yards. Recent imagery has shown one Kinzhal veering off course and striking near Starokostiantiniv in western Ukraine. This raises an interesting point. While Lima is proving effective against Russia's hypersonic missiles, it's by no means a perfect solution. Russia's Kinzhals generally still end up touching down on Ukrainian soil and detonating, which is no less devastating in terms of sheer explosive power than it would be if those missiles were hitting their intended targets. But that's the point. Those missiles aren't hitting what they're supposed to hit, and when those intended targets are often Ukraine's cities and energy infrastructure, it's far better to essentially convince a Kinzhal to detonate in a field somewhere than it is to allow it to touch down on far more valuable infrastructure. Ukraine protects what it needs to protect. Russia ends up losing a missile that's estimated to cost them about $10 million per unit. Though it may not be perfect, Lima represents a massive leap forward in Ukraine's EW capabilities. That's according to Nico Langer, who is a former German defense official whom Interesting Engineering quotes as stating that Ukraine's EW engineers have created a system capable of jamming Russian aerial bombs with UMPK. A UMPK is another name for Russia's glide bombs that are nowhere near as fast as Kinzhal missiles, pack a similar amount of explosive force, and have been deployed in massive numbers against Ukraine. On November 11th, David Axe claimed that Russia's fighter jets are launching 5,000 glide bombs per month at Ukraine, with that volume being enough that it's even wearing out Soviet-era fighters that are already approaching the ends of their lifespans. Like the Kinzhal, glide bombs use satellite navigation as part of their targeting, making them just as vulnerable to Ukraine's spoofing songs as Russia's hypersonic missiles. And it seems likely that the Lima will have a similar impact on any Russian weapon that uses GNSS signals to navigate. That means that Lima isn't just a Kinzhal killer. It could be used against everything from drones to hypersonic missiles. In its April 2025 profile of the Lima, Defense Redefined revealed that the EW system is also more versatile than Interesting Engineering's focus on spoofing suggests it to be. In addition to spoofing signals, Lima can also outright jam signals and is capable of some form of undefined cyber interference, which suggests that Lima could serve as a counter to Russia's own EW equipment. The same outlet also points out that a weapon's range, which is so often an advantage, becomes a major problem when Ukraine is using the Lima. The further a bomb is launched from the Lima system's location, the more distortion accumulates over time, resulting in substantial targeting errors, Defense Redefined reports. It then goes on to reiterate the effectiveness of Lima against Russia's glide bombs. In some instances, glide bombs have reportedly failed to reach their intended targets altogether, either detonating harmlessly in open fields or remaining unexploded. Earlier we told you that the Kinzhal has a 300-mile range. That range is large enough for Russia's fighter jets to launch the weapon far outside of Ukrainian air defenses that might be able to take these jets down. But in a case of extreme irony, the very range that protects Russia's jets is the same range that makes Kinzhal more vulnerable to Lima, assuming the EW system is deployed early enough in the Kinzhal's flight. Militani also took a look at the Lima in its own April article, and it highlighted what can happen to a missile when it loses access to its GNSS signal and has to rely on inertial navigation, which is what the Lima is doing to Kinzhals. The outlet used the example of American-made JDAM kits, noting that those kits have a circular probable error of between 1 and 5 meters, or between 3.2 and 16.4 feet. That is extremely accurate. However, the loss of connection to a GNSS signal increases that margin of error to 13 meters, or about 42.5 feet, after just 38 seconds. If the signal is lost for 100 seconds, the JDAM's circular probable error rockets up to 30 meters, or a little over 98 feet. Apply those findings to the Kinzhal, and you see why Russia has such a problem with the Lima. Ukraine using World War II-era songs to spoof the missile's signal is a slap in the face to Putin. But Russia's leader will be far more worried about the loss of GNSS over extended periods and what it means for Russia's missile assaults when weapons that cost $10 million per unit are being sent so far off course within a matter of minutes of being exposed to Lima. Putin will also be worried about what Lima represents. Even now, almost 4 years into its brutal war with Russia, Ukrainian ingenuity is overcoming Russian muscle. Interesting Engineering makes that point in its closing remarks on the Lima, stating, "The Lima's reported success highlights how Ukraine is adapting to Russia's long-range strike campaign through innovation rather than parity of firepower. Ukraine's innovation enabling its asymmetrical warfare tactics, both offensive and defensive, is a huge reason why it's been able to defend against Russia's numerical advantage for so long. According to the Atlantic Council, Ukraine's innovative defense sector is so important that it's become the country's trump card in its fight against Russia. The outlet offers examples, noting how Ukraine's plans to build 4.5 million drones in 2025 were made possible by garage engineers and a slew of startups that all focus their efforts on building ever more advanced attack and surveillance drones. Ukraine's innovation has allowed it to destroy enough of Russia's Black Sea fleet to make that fleet a non-factor in the war after everybody assumed it would offer Russia a massive advantage. Ukraine is building naval drones to complement its aerial drones, along with a host of missiles that enable it to strike deeper and harder into Russian territory. Systems like Lima represent that same spirit of innovation, only on the defensive end of the scale. The pattern by this point has become simple. Russia presents a problem with a new weapon, such as a hypersonic missile. Ukraine's genius engineers somehow come up with solutions to those problems that cost far less money to make than the problems themselves and are often deployed in record time to shatter whatever advantage Russia thinks it has. Lima is just the latest example of that spirit of innovation in action. Now that the EW system has proven itself against some of the most terrifying missiles that Russia has to offer, you have to assume that Ukraine will be moving it toward mass production. Right now, Lima is being deployed by just one Ukrainian unit, and it's already taken out around a dozen Kinzhals in a couple of weeks. Just how impactful will this revolution in EW be when Ukraine is able to deploy it across the country? We may find out if Our Father is Bandera starts ringing in the GNS receivers of more of the missiles that Russia is sending into Ukraine's territory. Oil means everything to Russia. It's both one of the country's greatest sources of income, and it's refined to produce the fuel that Russia's forces need for so much of the equipment they use in Ukraine. Without refined oil, Russia lacks everything from diesel that makes its tanks run to gasoline for its people, aviation fuel for its jets, and even lubricants that keep much of its equipment in good condition. And when Russia is being deprived of its oil money, it can't even build the equipment that runs on these refined products. That knowledge will make the last few days especially devastating for Russia. In a double blow to Vladimir Putin's invasion, Ukraine has once again struck deep inside Russia. Only this time, it's done it as China abandons Russia, perhaps once and for all. We'll start with Ukraine's strike. On November 11th, TVP World reported that Ukraine had hit Russia with a flurry of strikes during the previous evening, all of which targeted the country's oil. Among the targets were Russia's Saratov refinery, which seems to have become a particular favorite of Ukraine's drones, as well as the Orsknefteyorg's refinery that is located in the Orenburg Oblast. Adding to yet another series of strikes against Russia's ailing oil refining capacity, Ukraine also took aim at occupied Crimea. It conducted a strike against a sea oil terminal in Feodosia that Russia uses to transport oil out of the country and to its dwindling list of oil customers. That statement gives you a hint about how China has turned its back on Russia, but we'll get to that later in the video. All three of Ukraine's strikes deserve attention, though it's the Saratov one that exposes Russia in more ways than one. In its report on the attack on the Saratov refinery, the Moscow Times said that the attack, which occurred during the early hours of November 11th, represented the fifth time that Ukraine has hit this particular refinery during the fall. Expand the scope to all of 2025, and Saratov has had some of its key infrastructure taken out by Ukraine's drones a total of 7 times. You have to wonder what Russia's air defenses are doing to allow Ukraine to score so many direct hits on such an important refinery. If you listen to Russia's defense ministry, those air defenses are working as they should. On the night of this trio of attacks, the ministry claimed that its air defenses had shot down 37 of Ukraine's drones, with 8 of those being in the Saratov region. But that's what Russia always says, quickly followed by claiming that drone debris is the reason why its refineries end up burning. Russia avoided that excuse this time around. Instead, it chose not to acknowledge any attacks on the Saratov refinery at all. Instead, the region's governor, Roman Burzagin, claimed that Ukraine's drones injured one civilian and shattered the windows in several homes. Ukraine's general staff tells a very different story. Taking to Telegram, the general staff shared a photograph of the outcome of its strike, which appears to show the Russian refinery burning. It also said, "A series of explosions were recorded, after which a massive fire was observed in the area of the target. The results of the hits are being clarified." So we don't know exactly how much damage Ukraine did to the Saratov refinery, but we do know that the country's drones hit their target. It's an important target too. Ukraine's general staff goes on to point out that Saratov makes 20 types of refined oil products, including gasoline, diesel, technical sulfur, and vacuum gas oil. Many of these products are being used to serve the needs of the Russian occupiers fighting in Ukraine, meaning any attack on Saratov amounts to the weakening of Russia's ongoing assaults on Ukraine's territory. The Kyiv Independent adds that Saratov refinery processed about 4.8 million metric tons of crude oil in 2023, which gives us a solid idea of the refinery's size and importance to Russia. Ukraine's drones also had to travel a fair way to reach the refinery, as it's located about 370 miles to the east of the Ukraine war front line. However, distance isn't really a problem for Ukraine anymore. Its long-range drones and missiles are striking targets all over Russia. That takes us nicely to Ukraine's strike in the Orenburg region, which may have been even more impactful than the attack on Saratov. The Orsknefteyorsk refinery certainly seems to be larger than the Saratov refinery. That's according to the Kyiv Independent, which says the facility can process up to 6.6 million tons of crude oil annually. It can also turn that oil into more types of products, as the refinery makes more than 30, which include gasoline and diesel, along with aviation fuel, kerosene, and various types of oils. Add the Orsknefteyorsk refinery's capacity to that of the Saratov refinery, and you get up to 11.4 million tons of processing taken offline in a single night, assuming that Ukraine did enough damage to force refinery shutdowns. This strike represents the second time that Ukraine has hit Orenburg's main refinery, which perhaps suggests that the country has established a safe and repeatable aerial corridor to another massive refinery. Ukraine's general staff was also quick to get ahead of any Russian attempt to deny the success of the strike. As with the Saratov attack, it took to Telegram to announce what Ukraine had accomplished in Orenburg. As part of reducing the enemy's offensive potential and complicating the supply of fuel and ammunition to the military units of the occupiers, on November 11th, units of the Defense Forces of Ukraine hit the facilities of the Orsknefteyorsk oil refinery in the Orenburg region of the Russian Federation, the announcement read. We also have confirmation of what Ukraine managed to destroy in the strike. As the General Staff goes on to say, explosions and a fire were recorded on the territory of the facility. According to preliminary information, one of the primary oil processing units, APU, was hit. The results of that hit are being clarified. Processing units, as the name implies, are key to turning crude oil into usable products. The General Staff claims it hit one of these units in Orenburg, and again, like with the Saratov strike, it shared a picture to Telegram showcasing a massive plume of smoke rising into the sky above the refinery. So Ukraine delivered a swift 1-2 knockout to some of Russia's refining capacity. With oil production tackled for the night, Ukraine switched its focus to the facilities that Russia used to get its oil out of the country. We don't have as much information about Russia's Feodosia port as we do about the two refineries Ukraine hit in the early hours of November 11th. However, Ukraine's General Staff covered the important information in the same Telegram post in which it announced the Saratov strike. Also hit was JSC Marine Oil Terminal, a key hub for the supply of fuel and lubricants by sea to the Crimean Peninsula and the temporarily occupied territories of southern Ukraine. As with the Saratov strike, the full results of Ukraine's aerial assault are being assessed. However, it's believed that Ukraine managed to destroy or at least damage several tanks located on the site of the Feodosia port. The odds are that those tanks were filled with refined oil products, most likely fuel, that were going to make their way into occupied Ukraine by way of the Caspian Sea. All in all, it was a bad night for Russian oil, but really, it's been a bad few months. Ukraine has ramped up its strikes on Russia's oil over the last few months because it knows that the liquid gold that Russia produces helps to power Putin's war machine. The three strikes we just discussed are the latest in a series of dozens that have crippled Russia's refining capacity and are now looking to take out stored oil as well as the facilities that make Russia's fuel. To say that the impact of these strikes has been significant would be an understatement. Economically and militarily, Russia has been dealing with a kind of oil shock all of Ukraine's making during the last few months. On November 11th, Elliot Clark, writing for the Bloomsbury Intelligence and Security Institute, covered the extent of this impact. Clark says that Ukraine has targeted 55% of Russia's oil refineries, which has led to a severe decline in the income Russia generates from its fuel and other refined products. Why? Russia is making fewer of these products because so many of its refineries are offline. What the country is still able to make is being used to serve the military or its domestic population, which leaves very little left over to sell to other nations. In fact, Russia extended a total ban on gasoline exports, along with issuing a partial ban on diesel exports on September 30th, the Moscow Times reports. Neither will be sold as they once were until 2026, and that assumes that Russia is able to get its refining capacity back to where it needs to be. Clark provides short, medium, and long-term forecasts for Russia in the wake of Ukraine's relentless strikes. In the short term, Clark says, Ukraine is very likely to continue its strikes and Russia's citizens will have to deal with rising fuel prices. That's not ideal, given that Russia's fuel prices had risen by 11.6% already between January and October. More price increases now, especially due to supply being so low as a result of Ukraine's refinery strikes, are only going to cause more frustration domestically. Over the medium term, Clark adds, governments and businesses will inevitably seek new suppliers, given that Russia is no longer a reliable supplier of fuel. Selling cheap oil doesn't mean much for Russia when it doesn't have anything to sell. That's how other countries will start to see things too, and we get another hint at the blow that China delivered to Russia in November here. The same issues will persist over the long term, Clark concludes. That is, assuming Ukraine maintains the level of consistency of the refinery and oil storage strikes that we've seen since August. There's no reason why it wouldn't. Ukraine is building long-range drones by the thousands, and Russia doesn't seem to have the air defenses it needs to stop them. Chatham House adds that more attacks on Russia's oil refining offer Ukraine its best possible defense against Russia's focus on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. On November 10th, the outlet said that it's all about replying to Russia's pressure with pressure of Ukraine's own. That pressure is being felt domestically inside Russia, as Chatham House reports. In Crimea and a small number of other regions, there have been reports of petrol shortages. The government is under pressure to keep prices stable, to limit public dissatisfaction and broader questioning of the purpose of the war, the outlet claims. This involves Moscow paying subsidies to oil companies to compensate them for diverting production intended for export to the domestic market. The overall point is that Ukraine's strikes on Russian oil are costing Putin. That's all the more reason for them to continue. Russia's president would already have been smarting after hearing the news of this trio of Ukrainian strikes. The one saving grace, he might think, is that Ukraine is primarily targeting Russia's refined oil. Crude oil, though certainly not safe, is still available in huge quantities in Russia. That means the country can still sell plenty of crude to countries capable of refining that oil into products of their own. It's a strategy that has worked throughout the war. As Interfax reports, Russia managed to generate about $189 billion from the export of oil products in 2024, as it sold 7.6 million barrels per day, despite Western sanctions. More of the same should still keep the money flowing into Russia. However, 3.5 million barrels of the 7.6 million barrels per day were going to India and China, Interfax notes. And it's here, where China comes into play, to deliver the second major blow to Russian oil that Putin has been forced to absorb in the space of 24 hours. On November 11th, Newsweek reported that a Chinese oil refiner named Yanchang Petroleum, which is backed by one of China's provincial governments, has decided that it's going to cease all purchases of Russian oil. That announcement hasn't been made officially, but several anonymous traders who are familiar with the refinery say that pulling the plug on Russian oil is basically a done deal for the firm. United 24 Media follows up on this report by noting that Yanchang Petroleum processes about 348,000 barrels of oil per day, giving the company an annual refining capacity of about 127 million barrels. Of those barrels, 26 million make up the company's yearly import quota. For Russia, that may mean that 26 million barrels worth of crude oil sales have just vanished into thin air. That's the last thing that Putin wanted to hear, as two of his refineries and one of his ports burn as a result of Ukraine's long-range strikes. Worse yet, this news follows on from reports that several of China's state oil giants had suspended purchases from two of Russia's major oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil. We covered those suspensions and what they could mean in a separate video, so check that out if you want to learn more. Of course, the obvious question has to be asked: why is China suddenly turning its back on Russian oil? If you've already watched the video we just mentioned, you know that the answer can be summed up in two words: Donald Trump. After spending months dealing with Putin constantly lying about wanting to achieve a ceasefire or peace deal in Ukraine, only for the Russian president to intensify his attacks on Ukraine, Trump has started to follow through on the threats that he made. One of those threats was to impose harsher sanctions on Russian oil, and the US did just that on October 22nd. That's when the BBC reported that the US has implemented what Trump called tremendous new sanctions against the previously mentioned Russian oil giants Rosneft and Lukoil. The sanctions were big news. They represented the first direct intervention the Trump administration has made in 2025, suggesting that Putin's refusal to compromise on a peace deal has pushed the US president over the edge. By sanctioning these two companies, Trump also sent a clear message to Russia's oil buyers, including China. Keep buying from Russia and there will be financial hell to pay. China has heeded that warning, which is why we're now seeing so many of its companies pull away from Russian crude. As the BBC reported at the time, Trump is urging these countries, meaning China and India, to halt purchases of Russian oil altogether, forcing them to find alternative suppliers, possibly at a higher cost. but refusal to do so could see China and India attracting secondary sanctions from the US. China doesn't want to deal with secondary sanctions, and it seems that even the massive discounts Russia is offering on its crude oil aren't enough to tempt it to continue buying now that Trump is getting serious with his oil-related threats. Coming back to Yanchang Petroleum's decision, we have more evidence that the company is moving away from Russian crude due to a tender for deliveries that the company has released. That tender covers the period from December to mid-February, and the fact that it exists at all tells us that the company is looking for a new supplier. Russia used to sell plenty of oil to Yanchang. Newsweek suggests that the company usually accepted a shipment of Russian crude per month, so its decision to halt those shipments is likely to cost Russia millions, if not billions of dollars. It's decisions like these that will chip away at Putin's already diminishing war fund. As the BBC notes, Russia's crude oil accounts for almost 20% of China's energy imports. That was good news for Russia in one sense, as Putin likely believed that China had become so heavily dependent on Russian oil that it would struggle to move away. However, it also means that another 80% of the country's energy imports come from nations other than Russia, which tells us that China has more options than Putin might anticipate. What makes Yanchang's decision even more interesting is that it comes at a time when Russia is getting even more desperate to attract buyers for its crude oil. On November 6th, Reuters reported that Russia's Ural crude oil is trading at its steepest discounts versus Brent crude oil in about a year. The price gap between the two classifications of crude has increased to about $4 per barrel, from a previous $2 gap. Think about what this means in the context of 26 million barrels of crude that Yanchang imports per year. Assuming all of those barrels come from Russia, that $4 difference between Urals and Brent crude would amount to a yearly saving of $104 million. That isn't pocket change. It's a massive sum of money that Yanchang is willing to lose out on saving, and it all seems to be due to Donald Trump's sanctions. Putin will be hoping that China will come back on side. That's a distinct possibility, as there is a whiff of China waiting to see what happens with its relationship with the United States before it makes permanent decisions about whether its companies restart their Russian oil purchases. If that relationship goes south, Chinese companies may start buying Russian oil again. However, Trump seems to have sensed this, and he had already dangled a pretty major carrot on the end of a stick that he hoped would move China further away from Russia around 2 weeks before Yanchang made its decision. That carrot was tariffs, or more accurately, the reduction of them. On October 30th, NBC News reported that Trump had met with China's President Xi Jinping. The meeting was a 12 out of 10, according to Trump, and it led to Trump announcing that the US would immediately reduce its fentanyl tariff on China from 20% to 10%. Though other tariffs still remain in force, as NBC points out, it's pretty clear what Trump is doing here. Using the promise of reduced or eliminated tariffs, the US is pushing China into making a decision. Does it value cheap Russian oil or an easier trade relationship with the US? If Chinese companies halting Russian crude oil purchases is anything to go by, it seems that China would rather take steps to eliminate tariffs. That could be the death knell for Putin and his Ukraine invasion. If the US continues to reduce tariffs, essentially rewarding China for what Trump sees as good behavior in the process, Russia will lose out on billions of dollars per year. The crude oil that it's struggling to refine due to Ukraine's strikes won't even be sellable, and the pressure on Putin will mount.
It's official. Russia's air defenses have failed. Recent months have seen an almost non-stop assault of Ukrainian drone and missile strikes, and these aren't just taking place in occupied territories or a few miles over the border. Ukraine is blowing up targets all over Russia on a near nightly basis. There's very little the Kremlin seems to be able to do about it. Why? Well, it all comes down to one fatal weakness that has left literally millions of square miles of Russian territory utterly exposed to Ukraine's attacks. Vladimir Putin and the rest of Russia's leadership group had never have imagined it would come to this. When the war began back in February 2022, the Kremlin was confident of a quick and relatively easy victory. Much of the rest of the world agreed, with even the most optimistic Western analysts predicting that Ukraine would struggle to put up much of a fight. Even in the best hypothetical scenarios, it was expected that Kyiv's forces might manage to dig in and defend their lines, holding off Russia's mighty war machine long enough to potentially negotiate some sort of peace deal. Almost nobody foresaw that 3 years into the invasion, Ukrainian forces would be routinely blowing up Russian pipelines, fuel depots, and oil refineries with expert accuracy and lethal efficiency. But Ukraine has wowed the world, defied the odds, and is now in the strongest position it has been in years. In 2025 alone, according to figures from the Ukrainian Security Service, SBU, Ukraine has carried out close to 160 successful strikes against Russian oil extraction and refining facilities. This was revealed by the SBU's head, Vasyl Malyuk, at a press briefing in Kyiv on October 31st. Malyuk noted that 20 of those attacks had taken place in September and October alone, including strikes on 6 major oil refineries, 2 terminals, 3 fuel depots, and 9 pumping stations. These are legitimate military targets. Oil extraction and refining made up around 90% of Russia's defense budget. These are the dirty petro-rubles funding the war against us. As Malyuk notes, the likes of oil refineries and fuel depots are 100% fair and logical targets for Kyiv to aim at, as they play a huge role in keeping the Kremlin's war machine up and running and the country's economy afloat as well. It's only thanks to its massive oil industry that Russia has been able to fund the war as long as it has. So even though oil pipeline and pumping stations might not seem to be in the same class of targets as, say, bomb factories and airfields, they're arguably among the most valuable and vital pieces of military infrastructure that Russia has. And Ukraine is doing an extraordinary job in wiping them off the map. Dozens of these integral elements of Russia's fuel and oil industry have been blown to bits and set ablaze by Kyiv's tactical drone swarms and precision missiles. And the consequences have been catastrophic from Russia's point of view, with the country slipping into the grips of an unprecedented fuel crisis. As Malyuk notes, Russia's domestic fuel shortages have skyrocketed up to 20%, while 37% of its oil refining capacity has been slashed. Fuel deficits are being reported in no fewer than 50% of Russia's regions, and Moscow has been forced to take action, banning gasoline exports until at least the end of 2025. Hundreds of Russian gas stations have also been forced to cease operations due to the shortages, while others have imposed strict limits on how much gas and which varieties customers can purchase. Millions of Russian citizens are paying more for fuel than they have in years, and many are also struggling to find it in sufficient quantities, often forced to queue for hours on end just to fill up their vehicles so they can make the commute to work and back home each day. And the strikes show no signs of stopping anytime soon. Indeed, on the very same day that Malyuk spoke in Kyiv, reports emerged of yet another attack, this time targeting one of Russia's most important military fuel pipelines, situated in the Moscow region. The Ukrainian Main Directorate of Intelligence, GUR, shared a detailed report of this attack on Telegram. On October 31st, 2025, as a result of a special operation by the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, a very important military facility of the aggressor state of Russia was disabled. The Koltsovoy oil pipeline, which provided the Russian occupation army with resources for waging a genocidal war against the Ukrainian people. The Koltsovoy or Ring pipeline stretches almost 250 miles, 400 kilometers in total. It's an invaluable lifeline for Russia's armed forces, delivering a constant and steady supply of fuel for the Russian war machine. At peak capacity, it can pump up to 3 million tons of jet fuel, 2.8 million tons of diesel, and 1.6 million tons of gasoline, all from major refineries dotted around big Russian cities, including Moscow, Nizhny Novgorod, and Ryazan. According to the GUR's report, all 3 major fuel lines of the system were wiped out near the Remensky Direct, just a short distance southeast of Moscow. The GUR also outlined another important fact about this attack. The anti-drone net and the protection of the enemy facility by paramilitary guards did not help. All 3 threads through which the aggressor transported gasoline, diesel, and aviation fuel successfully and simultaneously exploded. The oil product pipeline was put out of action. As the agency notes, Russia reportedly had anti-drone defenses in place to protect the pipeline, along with paramilitary guards stationed in the area who were presumably tasked with scanning the skies and taking out any enemy drones headed their way. In short, the area at least had some degree of air defense capabilities. Yet they failed. And that has been a persistent recurring theme throughout the recent weeks and months in so many other reports of successful Ukrainian strikes on Russian infrastructure. Time and time again, Russia has set up defenses around its most important assets in a desperate attempt to keep them safe from Ukraine's drone and missile strikes. However, on an increasing number of occasions, those defenses have proven about as effective as blunt knives and dummy rounds. It's important to note as well that Ukraine isn't Russia. Russia regularly deploys gigantic, record-breaking swarms of drones over the border and into Ukraine's towns and cities. One attack in early September featured an estimated 805 drones in total, for example. The Kremlin's commanders don't shy away from launching enormous amounts of missiles at their enemy either, as many of the drone swarms are followed by at least a dozen missiles, if not more. Ukraine doesn't operate that way. It doesn't have the means or resources to deploy drones and other weapons in those kinds of quantities. Even its biggest and most iconic attack on Russian soil, Operation Spiderweb, which took place back in June, involved only 117 drones in total. So it's not the case that Ukraine is following Russia's playbook and attempting to overwhelm the enemy's air defenses with massive displays of force. Its attacks are far less intense as far as quantities are concerned, yet still consistently deal huge amounts of damage, leaving Russia with billions of dollars worth of broken, burning infrastructure. Somehow, even with smaller forces and limited resources, Ukraine's attacks are able to bypass the opposition's defensive systems, which have often been heralded by Putin and his Kremlin cronies as being among the best in the world. If that only happened every now and then, it could simply be put down to good fortune. But it happens all the time, all over Russia. Only days before the pipeline attack, for example, Ukrainian drones were seen in the skies above several Russian territories and major cities, including the capital, Moscow. While there were no reports of major damage in the Kremlin heartland, the very fact that Ukraine's drones even made it that far was staggering for several reasons. Firstly, Moscow is around 300 miles from the Ukrainian border, and it shouldn't theoretically be possible for normal drones to travel that far, across so much Russian land, without being spotted and taken out before they even get close to the capital. Secondly, as the richest, biggest, and by far most significant city in all of Russia, the home of the country's government and high society, Moscow should have some of the very best air defenses in the world. It should be capable of defending itself against even some of the best cruise and ballistic missiles, and should be able to make light work of a few dozen relatively cheap drones. Instead, a famous photo soon went viral after the incident, showing one of Russia's mobile air defense systems guarding the Kremlin. The team in question consisted of just 2 soldiers and a machine gun turret perched on the back of a simple pickup truck. In the background of the image, we see the famous walls of the Moscow Kremlin, the beating heart of Russia itself. It was a fascinating symbol of how far the country has fallen, as well as the perfect pictorial representation of the one fatal flaw in Russia's air defenses. There simply aren't enough of them in the places that matter the most. The country's commanders have dedicated the vast majority of their defensive assets to the occupied territories of Ukraine and border regions, leaving vast gaps and relatively defenseless areas deeper into its territory. As George Barros, the Russia Team and Geospatial Intelligence Joint Team Lead at the Institute for the Study of War, ISW, notes, once you get past that initial shell around the theatre in Ukraine, the rest of Russia has holes and vulnerabilities. Sasha Bruchman, a military analyst with the International Institute for Strategic Studies, IISS, in London, agrees, adding that Ukrainian attacks have depleted Russia's supplies of air defense assets, putting the Kremlin in an increasingly weak and precarious position. Russia has lost many air defense systems over the past 2 years, so it is plausible that there are many holes in their coverage that make successful attacks possible. There are several possible factors behind Russia's inconsistent air defense coverage. The first, as Bruchman notes, is simply the fact that Ukraine has managed to destroy quite a lot of these systems since the war began, and especially through 2024 and 2025, during which time we have seen Ukraine master the art of drone warfare and conduct more frequent and devastating attacks on Russia's assets. Time and again, the Kremlin's so-called world-leading air defense systems like S-300s and S-400s and even the cutting-edge S-500 have been obliterated, along with powerful radar systems that feed data to those systems to help them identify and intercept incoming targets. Many of these systems cost literally millions of dollars to make, so when Ukraine manages to damage or destroy one, it's no easy feat for Russia to simply build a replacement. Especially at the moment, when the country's economy is in such a terrible state, the Kremlin has to use its funds with at least some degree of prudence, and has largely preferred to focus its efforts on constructing more drones, missiles, and other offensive equipment, to the obvious detriment of its defenses. The second reason behind Russia's current troubles is quite simple. Russia is gigantic. It's the largest country on Earth, spanning an astonishing 11 time zones and extending across more than 6.6 million square miles, 17 million square kilometers. It's divided into dozens of regions, republics, and territories, with hundreds of cities housing anywhere from tens of thousands of people to several million, and countless smaller towns, villages, and settlements. Even with its powerful pre-war economy and status as the second strongest military force in the world, according to the official global firepower rankings, Russia cannot possibly defend all of these locations and all of its people at the same time. Even small countries often have blind spots in their defenses, and it would take an incalculable quantity of defensive systems, radars, and interceptors to cover the whole of Russia's vast lands. It can only work with a limited number of assets at its disposal, and Ukraine is bringing that number down with its consistent precision strikes. Every time Russia loses a missile battery, radar station, or interceptor launch platform, it gets just that little bit weaker, and the gaps in its air defenses get that little bit wider, paving the way for even more Ukrainian attacks. Meanwhile, Russia is left scrambling to plug the gaps as best it can. That's how we end up with situations where pairs of soldiers with machine guns are being asked to guard Moscow's government buildings and most famous cultural landmarks, for example. It's also one of the reasons why Vladimir Putin recently signed new laws that will allow Russia to deploy its reservist forces to defend regional infrastructure against future drone attacks. The country is quite clearly in dire straits, relying not on high-end state-of-the-art air defense systems and supersonic interceptor missiles to defend its territory, but groups of soldiers with Kalashnikov rifles to somehow keep its skies clear of enemy drones. The third and final reason behind Russia's increasingly weak and weedy air defense situation boils down to two simple words: arrogance and incompetence. From the moment this war began, Russia has displayed an astounding amount of both. Its arrogance was on display right from the early days of the invasion, when many of those first Russian troops who crossed the border were ordered to take parade uniforms with them as their commanders expected that they'd be marching through the streets of Kyiv in a matter of days. The incompetence, too, soon started to show. Like when Russia massively misused its air force, failing to attain aerial superiority over Ukraine despite having far more advanced aircraft and a significantly larger force, or when its fancy tanks started rolling over mines or being cornered in urban corridors by groups of civilians. Evidently, Russia thought it was far too strong to lose the war. It expected to roll right through any kind of defensive lines Ukraine might establish, raise the Russian flag over Kyiv, claim the Donbass and surrounding regions with minimal fuss, and celebrate a comprehensive, crushing victory over its opponent. It stands to reason, therefore, that the Kremlin's commanders probably weren't too concerned about the prospect of Ukrainian drone or missile attacks on their own territories. They likely never even conceived of such an idea, as it would have sounded utterly ludicrous to almost anyone at the time. So, rather than worrying about building up air defenses and perfectly positioning them across its various regions and republics, Russia focused almost exclusively on its offensive efforts, sending its tanks, armored vehicles, and mechanized brigades over the borders in a relentless, ruthless onslaught, pursuing only power and territory, never stopping to think or wonder what might happen if and when its opponent decided to fight back. Now, it's paying the price. Ukraine knows all about the gaps in the Russian air defenses. It made or expanded many of them itself, and it exploits them on an increasingly regular basis. And while not every attack is an enormous success, some of them have left Russia with truly devastating levels of damage to deal with. Back in April, for example, a Ukrainian drone packed with explosives struck one of Russia's Shahed drone factories in the Republic of Tatarstan, situated over 600 miles, 1,000 kilometers away from the Ukrainian border. Again, before the war began, the very thought of an enemy drone managing to travel so far into Russian territory and blow up a critical piece of its military infrastructure would have been unthinkable. Now, it's simply part of the new Russian reality, as the country's long-range radar coverage has become increasingly patchy and its ability to intercept even slow-moving targets like drones is embarrassingly limited. The situation in and around Moscow is slightly different, as Russia's commanders have at least orchestrated several layers of radar and missile systems in a ring around the country's capital, as confirmed by Alexei, a Ukrainian deputy commander in charge of air defense units guarding the northern side of Kyiv. There's a high concentration of Russian air defenses around Moscow. It's difficult for our drones to reach the city center. Even so, the late October assault proved that at least some of Ukraine's drones can and do make it into Moscow's airspace, And beyond the capital, many of Russia's other big cities have far fewer defenses, while its smaller towns and cities are almost helpless to withstand even a relatively small aerial assault. There's just one final obstacle facing Ukraine. In spite of all the gaps and fatal flaws in Russia's air defensive situation, Kyiv still lacks the full firepower it needs to exploit them all the way. There's no doubt that the Ukrainian armed forces have experienced enormous success with their drone and missile strikes so far, and they're constantly working on identifying new enemy assets to target and plan their next deep strike missions. They're also doing all they can to enhance their drone arsenal and bolster their missile systems, recently unveiling some exciting additions like the much-vaunted Long Neptune missile, as well as the Flamingo, with its massive range of up to 1,900 miles, 3,000 kilometers, and the Sapsan ballistic missile, the first of its kind to be made in Ukraine. Unfortunately, despite Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky confirming that these kinds of weapons have been tested and are due to enter serial production sometime soon, they're still not quite ready or available in sufficient quantities to really hit Russia where it hurts the most on a regular, recurring basis. Instead, if Ukraine really wants to deal the utmost damage to its enemy, it's going to need more assistance from its allies around the world. Fortunately, aid is on the way. More Storm Shadow missiles recently arrived in Kyiv from the United Kingdom, and Ukraine is pushing hard to get Germany to sign off on sending its long-range Taurus missiles to support the armed forces. It's also still in negotiations with the Trump administration in the US over the possibility of Tomahawk missiles or other long-range weaponry that would unlock a whole host of additional targets far and wide across Russia's regions. If and when Ukraine can get its hands on those kinds of missiles or make more of its own, there'll be no stopping it. Learn more about how Ukraine is turning the tide of the war in this video, which looks at how Putin experienced one of his worst ever months in October, with massive losses and only the most marginal gains on the ground. Or, for another example of a Ukrainian drone attack wreaking havoc on Russian infrastructure, watch this video, which looks at a recent precision strike at oil depots, fuel bases and trains across occupied Crimea. Make sure to subscribe to our trusted channel too for more breaking news, updates and in-depth assessments of how the Russia-Ukraine war is progressing and what might happen next.